The news now on BBC One with Hugh Edwards.
Tonight at 10, Theresa May apologises to Conservative MPs for the party's performance at the general election. The Prime Minister spent much of the day trying to agree a deal with the Democratic Unionists to keep the Conservatives in power. She told a meeting at Westminster that she'd got the Conservatives into a mess and she was the right person to get them out of it.
The Prime Minister was superb, really statesmanlike and humble in recognising the difficulties, but forthright in tackling the problems the country faces.
Earlier, Mrs May convened her new cabinet as ministers acknowledged that the Queen's speech setting out the government's plans might be delayed.
We're in talks with the Democratic Unionist Party to see the deal that we can put together, and I'm very optimistic that will happen, but obviously until we have that, we can't agree the final details of the Queen's speech.
And the start of the formal Brexit talks due in a week's time might also be delayed following a meeting between senior officials in Brussels today. Also on the programme. In Libya, the house where the Manchester bomber stayed just days before the attack, he'd been under surveillance there for a month. Thousands on the streets in Russian cities protesting against corruption, but many of the organisers have been arrested. And what was the impact of social media on the election campaign? We'll examine the evidence.
And coming up in Sports Day on BBC News, Pakistan will face England in the Champions Trophy semi-finals after a thrilling 3-wicket win over Sri Lanka in Cardiff.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has told Conservative MPs this evening that she will serve them as party leader for as long as they want her. 4 days after the election, which resulted in a hung Parliament, Mrs May told her fellow Conservatives that she was the person who'd got them into this mess and she was the one who'd get them out of it. Earlier in the day, Downing Street confirmed that the Queen's speech setting out the government's legislative plans could be delayed. It's meant to take place in a week's time. Labour said it was further evidence that the government was in chaos, as our political editor Laura Kunsberg tells us.
The band plays on in Theresa May's backyard. Strangely, business as usual at the back gates. At the front tonight, even after her personal disaster of the election, the Prime Minister seemed relieved enough to chat to the cat. After she had fessed up her mistakes to MPs.
Theresa May said that she got us into this situation and she's the lady who's going to get us out of it.
Humble in recognising the difficulties, but forthright in tackling the problems the country faces.
Hello, Chief Whip, how are things going? Can the Prime Minister stay on, do you think? Does she have the confidence of her party?
Of course she has.
But Theresa May knows power has shifted from her to the Cabinet and her party.
Do you have confidence in Theresa May's leadership, Secretary of State?
Excuse me, Laura, thank you.
Do you have confidence in the Prime Minister? Do you think she can survive this? Do you have confidence in the Prime Minister after the election?
Arriving for the first meeting, they weren't all quite ready to give full-throated support.
Do you have confidence in the Prime Minister, though? Absolutely.
Having lost the Tories' majority, Theresa May needs to convince her cabinet colleagues she is still right for the job. They look like they need to convince themselves.
I've had some very productive discussions with the DUP.
The Tories' hopes of getting anything done lie in a deal with Northern Irish MPs. It's not even clear yet if the Queen's speech, the official start of the government and its business, will go ahead as planned next week.
I think that the details of the Queen's speech, the substance of the Queen's speech is what matters. It's been known for some days that we are seeking an agreement with the Democratic Unionist Party that will provide the stability in parliamentary votes that will allow us to do the many important things we need to do.
Some loyal supporters were trying to cheer Theresa May up. But the fact that scores of newly elected Labour MPs are arriving here and old Tory MPs departing means Theresa May is going to have to change, whether she likes it or not. She is a weakened Prime Minister with no majority in this place, and that means any of the more controversial ideas in her manifesto will bite the dust. It's probably goodbye to more grammar schools, probably an end to the idea of tightening up pensioner benefits. The simple truth, Theresa May can't guarantee she'll get her way.
I think it would be great if she now gets the government in place, which she started to do yesterday, and starts these negotiations, and then she can then herself make any decisions about the future.
There are demands too to shift on her approach to the biggest policy of all, how we leave the EU. Cabinet ministers have told me there has to be a change of tone, and there are open calls for a change of priority.
You know, there's a lot to discuss, a lot to dissect, but we do have to make sure that we invite other people in now. This isn't just going to be a Tory Brexit, this is going to have to involve the whole country.
She was putting forward one vision. You and others are now telling her it has to change.
A majority Conservative government was putting forward a vision, and we're no longer a majority Conservative government. We are going to have to work with others. That means that we are going to have to invite people in and try and take more people with us, and I think that can be a positive step.
The immediate sense of danger to Theresa May seems to be slowing, but she's vulnerable, having to answer to colleagues in Parliament having failed to persuade the country. Gentle turmoil, while the routines and rhythms of this place stay the same.
Let's go live to Westminster tonight, and Laura is there. Laura, this meeting tonight of the 1922 committee, surely just the first of many tests for Theresa May.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, Hugh. I mean, I think this meeting tonight, the Tories sort of managed to cheer themselves up. Theresa May put in a good performance. Several MPs afterwards said if only she'd actually pulled that kind of thing off during the campaign, then I think they might actually have won the election. That was the view. I think pleasure at the fact she'd risen to the occasion tonight, but frustration that that's just not what they saw in the campaign. But I think despite tonight they were a bit more perky. Let's be absolutely honest about this. The Conservative Party is in a bad place right now. Just a few days ago, they were expecting this to be the first day getting back to Westminster. Theresa May should have been putting together a brand new cabinet. She should have looked like she was all guns blazing. They were expecting that she would have swept back to victory. Instead, they are still trying to put together their deal with a small group of Northern Irish MPs, the DUP. In fact, they actually have been working with them informally for the last couple of years. So there's no expectation that they won't be able to reach a deal. It's likely it'll happen tomorrow. But even once they get a deal done, the Tories and the DUP will have a puny majority of only 6. And of course that puts paid to any of the big, controversial, interesting ideas that the Tory party might have in the next couple of years. That is a deal that guarantees an element of survival, but genuinely not much else. And I think the thing that a lot of Tories are finding difficult tonight is they still don't quite understand why it went so badly wrong. Remember, they were the biggest party with the most seats and the most votes, but they have ended up feeling like they have been badly defeated. They are rallying round their leader tonight, but out of necessity rather than desire.
Laura, again, thanks. Laura Kuenssberg there at Westminster. Well, the formal Brexit negotiations were due to start next Monday, but that date is now in doubt following a meeting between senior EU and British officials in Brussels today when they failed to confirm the date. Earlier today, the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, insisted that talks would still take place, and he said the government would stick to its commitment to leave the European single market, despite growing calls from some MPs to be more flexible. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, said it was clear there was no public backing for a so-called hard Brexit. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, considers the future of Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit, says Theresa May, but what does it mean? The 2-year countdown continues next week. Then UK and EU negotiators must thrash out a deal if they can. They've got till the end of March 2019. Then Britain's out. So what are the challenges of Brexit, and can ministers find an answer? European imports cross British borders freely now. EU leaders say people must too if free trade's to go on. So how to keep free movement of goods into Britain but not people? The government says it's sticking to that mission, but open to ideas.
What we will be doing, of course, as I have actually through the last 10 months, is listening to all the contributors and say, if you've got better ideas, tell me, and we'll hear and we'll consider them.
Lots of work to do.
The Cabinet has no detailed plan. The Chancellor wants to keep business supplied with vital European workers. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, does too, but wants migration down in the end. Trade Secretary Liam Fox is tougher still, wants out of the EU, even if that means no deal. But the parliamentary pressures after the election are huge. This debate's been going round in circles. Since the election, it's picked up pace. Brexiteers want to break free of all EU control. Others say compromise on migration, on EU payments, for the sake of a deal.
Whether it's on movement of people, how the rules can be adjusted, budget payments, things like that, I think there needs to be a bit of flexibility, because the politicians' job is to make this work for the nation as a whole, not to dispute amongst themselves.
17.4 million people voted for the simple principle that decisions should be made by democratically elected politicians here in Westminster that decide our laws, our money and our borders. And that's what should be negotiated starting next Monday.
Labour wants all options kept open. Trade and cooperation count for more than keeping migrants out, they say.
We need a collaborative approach. We need to get rid of the idea of tick-boxing hard Brexit and obsessions with things like the European Court and bringing down migration numbers. We need an outcome that works for businesses and for people across the country.
Nicola Sturgeon showed off her Scottish nationalist contingent, shrunk to 35 MPs, but still, she says, owed a greater hearing on Brexit.
The approach that the government was taking to a hard Brexit, I think, is dead in the water and cannot stand. I'm calling today for a process that is opened up to include more voices, all parties and all four nations of the UK, and an approach that has continued membership of the single market at its heart.
Most of the MPs who will be sworn in here this week were elected on a promise to deliver Brexit. There are many ideas of how and what's best for Britain. If there is a plan, it'll only emerge slowly through long, hard negotiation, and no one can say now what it'll look like. Opinions may shift here and across the country, and some even believe no plan could be agreed before another election. So a deal to exit the European Union is not yet within reach. That's assuming it ever is. It'll take endless wrangling between now and the 2-year deadline for Brexit before we find out what it truly means. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's go live to Brussels and talk to Katya Adler, our Europe editor. What's the reaction there, Katya, to the developments at Westminster?
Well, Hugh, Brussels is trying really hard not to react to what it sees as a domestic British situation. But if you think about it, it's surreal not to act when we're just days away from what should have been the very first political face-to-face Brexit negotiations between the EU and the UK. And now all of a sudden, the UK erupts in the sea of, well, what Brexit should we have? Hard or soft, open, conciliatory or cliff edge? And Brussels is putting its hands over its ears and trying to borrow the British motto of keeping calm and carrying on. In fact, it says until it receives official notification otherwise from the UK, it's going to carry on with Theresa May's letter of notification that she sent back in March saying we're leaving the EU, including the single market and the customs union as well. Now, of course, the EU wishes that weren't the case. In fact, one high-level source said to me tonight it is the secret wish of many Europeans that Britain would change its mind and stay in the EU. But just to underline this, there is zero expectation of that. In fact, the EU's chief negotiator today sent 2 very detailed Brexit negotiating documents to Downing Street. There were the start of those technical talks here between the two sides, but very much on the level of when should we meet, how often, and so on. We do not know when those political negotiations will in fact start. So to sum up, the reaction here is we're ready in Brussels when you, UK, are ready.
Katya, thanks again. Katya Adler there for us with the latest thoughts there in Brussels. Well, the Democratic Unionist Party is not only negotiating with Theresa May, as we've heard, it's also resumed talks on restoring the power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland. There's been no First Minister or Deputy First Minister since January. But Sinn Féin says that Theresa May's government can no longer be seen as an honest broker in that process because it's now dependent on the DUP, potentially, for survival at Westminster. Our Ireland correspondent, Chris Buckler, has the latest on those Stormont talks.
North Antrim is a Democratic Unionist heartland, where many voters choose the party, at least partly because of their religion. The DUP's opposition to same-sex marriage and abortion has concerned some MPs at Westminster. But politicians and voters in this corner of the UK can be more conservative than many Tories. Do you think they need to change those kind of views?
No, well, I would agree with those views, I'm sorry. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, and if that's your opinion, then you should stand for your rights. We have a right to speak out, so we do.
The DUP used a veto to block the introduction of same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. It was just one of a series of disagreements with Sinn Féin that led to the collapse of Stormont.
He represents the British government.
But the potential marriage of convenience between the Conservatives and the DUP has left Republicans questioning if the British government can really be seen as honest brokers in the talks to try to restore power sharing.
We don't believe that any deal between the DUP here and the English Tories will be good for the people here. And any deal which undercuts in any way the process here or the Good Friday and the other agreements is one which has to be opposed.
Watching on as Sinn Féin spoke were members of the DUP. Their Westminster ambitions could have an impact on Parliament buildings in Belfast, where their relationship and devolved government collapsed at the start of the year.
Those issues which are devolved should be dealt with by the devolved administration here in Northern Ireland. But if others decide that they're not coming back into the devolved administration here in Northern Ireland, then those issues will have to be dealt with at Westminster. It is really for Sinn Féin to decide where they want those powers to lie.
The British and Irish governments were supposed to be bringing Stormont's parties together in these talks. Now London is having to reassure Dublin about their intentions.
Yes, the discussions that may be taking place between ourselves and the DUP in relation to an agreement in Westminster, but that being entirely separate from our intent and desire to see devolution being restored here.
But after a very brief statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, no questions.
The Northern Ireland Secretary left rather quickly. Perhaps a sign that the Conservatives feel a little uncomfortable with their current position. Tomorrow the DUP will head to Downing Street with demands, like money for the economy here. But for this deal to work, the two parties will need to have faith in each other. The DUP have still to spell out exactly what they want in return for their support, but I suspect a lot of it will be about finances and also influence. They'll want cash for public services, for the economy, and a say on things like Brexit. And I suspect they'll also avoid some of the contentious issues that led to the collapse of power sharing here at Stormont. Nonetheless, Theresa May knows that she's got to be careful in what she agrees to. Otherwise, what's good for Westminster could end up causing her problems here in Northern Ireland further down the line.
Chris, thanks very much for those latest thoughts there at Stormont. Chris Buckler. Well, business leaders are warning of a dramatic drop in confidence following the general election result. A survey of 700 members of the Institute of Directors suggests that there is concern that the political uncertainty could be very damaging for the UK economy. But the organisation says there is no desire among members for another election. Our business editor Simon Jack reports on that Business View.
Coming up fast. Brexit negotiations are due to start next Monday, but after the election result, the direction of travel is more uncertain than ever, and businesses like Aston Martin are worried.
It's almost the worst of all worlds, because you now have a hung parliament where nothing can be taken as a given. Let's understand the direction of travel. Let's work between government and industry. Let us understand where we're going to, and we can adapt to the situation, and that will allow us then to continue the investments that we're already planning.
On Friday, in the immediate aftermath of the election, business groups gathered here at the Department for Business with a regular meeting with the Secretary of State. Now the problem is many of them feel that up to now their voice goes no further than this building, and are hoping that a weakened Theresa May will have to listen more to her cabinet colleagues and to the voice of business, particularly when it comes to Brexit.
Up to now, I don't think business has managed to get its views across effectively enough, or it simply hasn't been listened to. And that's particularly true of smaller businesses. Now I think we've got a bit of a window, and that might change, and that might enable there to be a bit of a rethink about some of these questions about the single market, the customs union, how the regulatory frameworks are going to work.
While many, in fact most businesses would like to retain preferential access to our largest export market, John Elliott, who runs this electrical goods manufacturer in County Durham, says we must not lose sight of why people like him voted to leave.
I hope common sense prevails. My view of the Brexit is that we've got to leave and become the same as the other people who aren't in the European Union, countries like USA, Canada, Australia, Japan, and we tread like them and give up our free access to the single market, but get back control of our economy and immigration.
Immigration is already starting to fall, and there was more evidence of that today. There's been a 96% fall in the number of EU nationals registering to work as a nurse in the UK.
This business-friendly government.
The Institute of Directors polled its members over the weekend, and last week's election has had a clear negative impact on business morale.
There's been a sudden drop in business confidence as a direct result of what happened on the election. Our members are feeling much less confident about the prospects for the UK economy, and they're concerned about the potential impact on their own businesses as well.
It may be that the business voice gets a wider audience in government, but with so much political uncertainty, even that prospect is not doing much to lift the gloom. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Let's have a look at some of the day's other news then. Security officials in Libya have told the BBC that the bomb attack in Manchester last month, in which 22 people were killed, was being planned last December. For more than a month before the attack, they say they had the bomber Salman Abedi under surveillance in Libya. The officials have also complained about poor security cooperation with Britain, which they say must be improved to prevent further attacks. From Tripoli, our correspondent Ola Gerin has sent this report.
An abandoned house on the outskirts of Tripoli, linked to mass murder in the UK. This is where the Manchester bomber spent a quiet month with his family, leaving days before the attack. The BBC has been told that throughout his stay, Salman Abedi was under surveillance here, along with his father and his brother. It's unclear if Britain was informed. Security officials say the brother, Hashim, has admitted he and Salman joined IS in 2015 and he bought parts for the bomb.
Yeah, we have important information about this attack in Manchester.
The spokesman for Libya's Special Deterrence Force, which is still interrogating Hashim and his father, told us the attack was being planned since last December. Such is the insecurity here, he prefers not to show his face.
We have information about Salman's friends and Hashim there in England here and here in Libya, and what did they buy from Manchester to make the bomb, and we have some information about their contacts there in Manchester.
So far, Manchester police have not set foot in Libya, where power often lies in the shadows. Militias vie for influence here, along with 3 rival governments. The key question for Britain is who to deal with here, who to share intelligence with, and that issue is increasingly urgent. But even now, after the Manchester bombing, Libyan officials have told us they have far better security cooperation with the CIA than with London. This general works for the UN-approved government in Tripoli. He told us there are difficulties exchanging intelligence with Britain. My message is clear, he says. This crime has happened. We don't want it to happen again in Britain or anywhere else. We want strong cooperation with British security agencies as soon as possible to avoid similar attacks. The BBC understands British officials feel it will take time to build cooperation because of the instability on these shores. But officials here say delays will favour IS. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Tripoli.
The Duchess of Cambridge has been meeting victims of the London Bridge terror attack who are recovering at King's College Hospital in South East London. She's also met some of the doctors and nurses who treated those who were hurt in the attack. All of the injured who made it to hospital have survived. In Moscow and several other Russian cities, thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets to protest against corruption and against the oppressive policies of President Putin. Scores of people were arrested in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, and the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who organised some of the protests, was taken into custody too. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg has the story.
1 mile from the Kremlin, a public holiday turned into a public battle. Russia Day is supposed to be a national celebration. But riot police were sent in to clear anti-government protesters from Moscow's main street. Thousands had come to accuse the Russian leadership of corruption. Putin is a thief, they shouted, and 1, 2, 3, Putin, it's time to leave. families accidentally caught up in the violence fled. Police detained hundreds of protesters.
The police have been telling the crowd that people don't have the right to protest here, that they don't have permission. But the protesters have been saying they don't need permission because Russia Day is their day too.
There were anti-corruption demonstrations in more than 100 Russian towns. As for the man who'd organised this nationwide protest, opposition leader Alexei Navalny, he was detained as he left home. Vladimir Putin said nothing today about the protests. Instead, he played tour guide in the Kremlin to a group of children. This is how President Putin would rather be seen, not as a corrupt leader, but as father of the nation. And certainly not everyone today was in the mood to criticise the government. In Moscow, this patriotic festival, on the same street as the protest, was celebrating Russian military might. Protests don't make life better, he says. Not one revolution has ever brought anything good. Up the road, this was no Russian revolution, but it was a display of defiance from those people, many of them young Russians, who believe their country needs change. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
In France, President Macron's new centrist party, En Marche, looks set to win a landslide victory in this weekend's final round of parliamentary elections. The party is on course to win more than two-thirds of the seats in the National Assembly. Our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson reports on the diversity of the party's candidates, many of whom represent a new presence in French politics.
Politics, says Cédric Villani, is a matter of probability, with a bit of game theory thrown in, which goes some way to explaining why a mathematician specialising in non-linear Landau damping is topping a race for Parliament. It's still his boss's poster that gets the kisses, but unlike many of the new faces running for the president's party, Cédric is already well known as a maths genius with a string of awards and a passion for spiders.
I've always been an idealistic in my professional lives. As a researcher, as a teacher, as a director, I will continue as a member of parliament, trying not to be naive, but always ideal.
Among the hundreds of new party candidates are a former bullfighter, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, a fighter pilot, entrepreneurs and a judge. Mr Macron's bid to bridge the old political left and right has been popular enough to win him the presidency and probably the parliament too. But such a broad church could be vulnerable.
There will be quite a few older political figures, and they are like wolves in the forest encircling the village and waiting to hear if they can enter and see if they can already pick up a few lambs which are getting away from the herd.
If predictions for next Sunday are correct, Emmanuel Macron will have remade French politics in the space of 6 weeks. But behind all the talk of a new era is the fact that for 3/4 of voters here, he was not the first choice for president. And in the first round of the parliamentary polls, half the electorate stayed away. Emmanuel Macron has built his movement on a renewal of democracy, grassroots, representative, open to all. But a sweeping majority in Parliament could leave little room for opposition, and without a real debate among politicians, he could end up facing grassroots democracy in a more familiar, more obstructive role. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Let's have more then on the aftermath of the election, and throughout this week we'll be looking at some of those factors which influenced the result. Labour's online political advertising was reported to be notably successful, especially in the final days of the campaign. So our media editor, Amal Rajan, has taken a look at the role played by social media in shaping the outcome of the 2017 election.
The nurses going hungry, schools in decline. I don't recognise this broken country of mine. They're having a laugh.
Energetic, cool and full of anger. Like many of the endorsements Jeremy Corbyn received, this song, downloaded nearly 3 million times on YouTube, was designed to be shared on social media. Many of the ads on Facebook from Labour's official campaign had a positive, colourful message for the whole country.
I've been involved in opposing anti-tax
By contrast, many Tory ads like this one were grey, doom-laden and focused mainly on one thing: Corbyn's character. A project set up to analyse the impact of political messaging on Facebook found that in the final days of the campaign, Labour's message targeted 464 constituencies compared to just 205 for the Tories.
If you look at a Facebook feed, probably 9 out of 10 posts aren't an ad. It's actually not that common for people to see ads by any one advertiser. So if you have a feed that's absolutely full of shared content from the Labour Party, one blue ad amongst that sea of red isn't really going to stand out.
Like the Canary.
Over the course of the general election campaign, nearly 1 in 3 Facebook users in the UK saw one of Momentum's videos, and we were able to create content that was accessible, appealing, and spoke to issues which affect people in society. And I think that was a big part of our appeal. We also had volunteer filmmakers and video editors throughout the UK who gave their time to make a lot of this content.
In years gone by, newspapers set the political agenda, but their influence is in decline. This digital army uses social media and mobile technology to generate huge audiences for a message that they, rather than journalists, get to control. To many activists, tabloids and broadcasters like the BBC are the enemy. Last week, a video of a pro-Corbyn supporter burning copies of Britain's tabloids went viral. As one former editor of The Sun notes, the very idea of a newspaper seems antiquated to many young voters.
Generations now expect their information to be delivered instantaneously, and the idea of perhaps printing millions of print products and loading them onto a huge articulated lorry, taking them to all corners of the country, by which time they're 12 hours out of date, it is a massive challenge. We all have £500 personal computers in our pockets now where we get instantaneous access to information.
A quarter of a century after The Sun claimed to have swung an election, social media has destroyed Fleet Street's monopoly on political opinion. As a younger generation mobilises online, newspapers may find they no longer get their way. Amol Rajan, BBC News.
A look there at the potential impact of social media on the campaign. That was Amol Rajan, our media editor. And that's it for now here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.